So we're going to get started here. We're a few minutes late. There were some track signaling issues on the one line today, so we gave people a few extra minutes to get up here. We have some wonderful background music playing in from the courtyard, as we like to think of it. So I'm Nick Diakopoulos. Welcome to the Tau Center event series on computational journalism. Tonight we're going to be talking about algorithms and algorithmic accountability reporting, the idea that we might be able to do investigative journalism on algorithms. I'm a fellow at the Tau Center working in this area, developing some ideas and a white paper on this topic that will launch next month. So if this is interesting for you, please keep your eyes peeled on the Tau Center site where we'll be publishing that early next month. I'm joined tonight by three very esteemed panelists who are sitting on the couch up front here. We have joining us Scott Klein. He's the editor of news applications at ProPublica, where he directs a team of journalist programmers that build large interactive software projects that tell journalistic stories. Scott's worked on all kinds of different projects like Dollars for Docs and the Opportunity Gap. And he's also done some real reporting, some real investigative reporting, looking at reverse engineering algorithms in a journalistic context. We also have visiting us tonight Kathy O'Neill, who is currently a data scientist at Johnson Research Labs. Kathy has a background in mathematics. She has her PhD from Harvard and did a postdoc at MIT. And was also a professor at Barnard College before she, quote, chucked it all and went over to the private sector, where she has worked at hedge funds, various hedge fund companies before landing at Johnson Research Labs. She also writes the popular blog mathbabe.org, so we have the Math Babe visiting us tonight. We also have Clifford Stein, our third panelist tonight. He's a professor in industrial engineering and operations research and computer science at Columbia University. His background is in, he has his PhD from MIT and has worked on all kinds of different algorithms, network algorithms, scheduling algorithms, internet algorithms, and so on. He's published over 75 different scientific papers in the area, and is also very well known for co-authoring two textbooks, Discrete Math for Computer Science and Introduction to Algorithms, which has been referred to as the Bible of the field. So we're very happy to welcome our visitors here tonight. I'm going to kick off the evening with a presentation based on the research that I've been working on the white paper that will be published. And then our panelists will come up and do a little bit of public critique of the presentation. And then we'll sort of move into a broader conversation about algorithms in journalism. And we'll open it up to QA from the audience. I should mention, if you have things you want to tweet, mark your tweets with hashtag TauTalk, or send your questions over to Tau Center on Twitter, or visit us at taucenter.org for more information. All right, so having said that, I will jump in. So it was about 14 years ago when Lawrence Lessig taught us that we should be interrogating the architecture of cyberspace as we interrogate the code of Congress. And really what he was driving is the idea that the architecture of systems, the code and the algorithms that run technical systems can be a very powerful influence on liberty, on our personal liberty. So let me give you a recent example of that. Last month, the New York Times published a big article talking about mugshot websites. You may have come across these. The idea is that these sites collect and organize and search engine optimize, so they SEO, mugshot photos that have been scraped from other police departments. And by SEOing them, they make it so that if you type in someone's name, their mugshot photo will rank very highly on a Google search. Now, having your photo rank highly having your mugshot photo rank highly on a Google search is probably a little bit embarrassing. It might have sort of implications for finding a job or other kinds of relationships if people can sort of see this information very easily. And these sites realize this, obviously, and they're sort of taking advantage of it by essentially extorting money from people, saying, hey, if you pay me $500, I'll take your photo down off of this site, and you won't have to deal with the idea, the reality of someone typing in your name and seeing your mugshot photo. So, as a society, there's a few different ways we can deal with this, right? We can pass laws that, make it illegal for websites to do this kind of activity, to extort money from people in order to take their photo down. Or we can use market forces like credit card companies denying, payment processing for these websites. Or we can use algorithms to help deal with this problem. So, in the same way that law or market forces can sort of affect change in society, algorithmic power can be used here to change the ranking algorithm that Google uses. So in fact, this is what happened. Google was tipped off to this problem with these sites that were ranking these mugshot photos earlier this year, and by later this year, when the New York Times published their big story on it, they had already updated their algorithm, their ranking algorithm, so that these sites were essentially considered more as spam than as real information sites, and that had the result of down-weighting and down-ranking these mugshot photos when you search for their name. So that's sort of an example of how algorithms can potentially be used for good in society, but you can imagine much more sort of possible negative outcomes from using algorithms this way too. Of course, algorithms are everywhere now, so it's not just online media and search, although that's certainly something that we come across, most of us probably on a daily basis. We also find algorithms cropping up across government and business, so everything from political messaging, romantic matching, advertising systems, predictive policing. So the police are using algorithms to decide where to deploy more police force. Things like social service management, welfare management, copyright infringement detection. Google has an algorithm called Content ID that scans everything that gets uploaded to YouTube and tries to determine, is this infringing content or is this not infringing content. Things like credit scores, teacher rankings, censorship, the IRS audit flag. So the IRS uses algorithms to try and identify and predict who are the most, which tax returns deserve the most scrutiny that come in. Things like matching students to high schools is helped with algorithms. Twitter trends, news personalization, college rankings, and online dynamic pricing. So you get a sense for a very broad range across government and business where algorithms are getting used. I think it behooves us to think a little bit more carefully about the power that algorithms potentially have in these different domains. Which brings us to the next issue, which is that algorithms are particularly good at obfuscating information. They're opaque. The typical sort of metaphor is a black box, right? You can't really see what's going on inside the algorithm. And even though algorithms are often written in human readable software code, at some level they are eventually translated into the language of computers, binary code, which makes it very, very difficult. There's perhaps only a handful of people who could look at binary code and actually tell you what it's doing. Most of those people probably work at microchip manufacturing companies. I certainly couldn't tell you what a computer algorithm is doing by looking at the machine code. So algorithms sort of have this opacity to them, and that's compounded by the complexity of algorithms that become a real barrier for people understanding what's going on inside them. So I think what we're lacking as a public is really some clarity on what's going on inside that black box and how algorithms might be exerting power over people in society in a way that maybe journalists need to start thinking about more carefully. So this sort of leads to the three main research questions that I've been exploring in the white paper that we're publishing. So the first question is, how can we even characterize the bias or the power that an algorithm is exerting? Can we describe it in some way? Can we try and identify areas where algorithms might be wronging us or making mistakes that are somehow consequential or making decisions that are somehow consequential to us? And then, of course, what is really the role that journalists might play in all of this? Is there a role for journalists to play in holding algorithmic power to account? in the same way that investigative journalism has typically focused on holding powerful institutions to account, as I've said, alongside legal and market forces, algorithms are sort of a new form of power that we're experiencing in society. And I think, as journalists, we need to think about ways to understand that power. So I'll talk about a few different ways that we can try and characterize power now, and just go through some examples. So on a theoretical level, we can talk about sort of the crux of algorithmic power, which is really autonomous decision making. This is what gets us a little antsy, right? We have this automated piece of software that's starting to make decisions for us. And if it makes a decision that we disagree with, we might feel that we've been wronged in some way, or we might wonder, why did it make that decision and not some other decision? So we can start asking questions about, what kinds of decisions do algorithms actually make? And we can try and break that down into almost atomic level decisions and look at things like prioritization, classification, association, and filtering. So algorithms can prioritize things. They create rankings, like college rankings. This is used by the city of New York, for instance, in fire inspections. So they try and predict what buildings in the city need the most attention in terms of a fire inspection, and they dispatch their inspectors according to that risk profile. We can talk about classification, so algorithms deciding, is this thing an instance of A or B or C? So I gave the example of the Google Content ID algorithm that's used on YouTube. So it's deciding, is this video in the class of infringing content or in the class of non-infringing content? Algorithms can also make associations. So imagine yourself using an algorithm to do an investigation of medical fraud. You might find that there's an association between one doctor and, say, another group of doctors, and that other group of doctors might be known to have been fraudulent. And that association with this other doctor might sort of cast some connotation or some additional scrutiny on that person. And then finally, we can talk about filtering. So, fairly typical operation is, using algorithms to remove something, exclude something algorithmically. And you can also imagine sort of composing these atomic types of decisions into higher level decisions. So if you think about something like summarization, summarization is really a process of prioritizing bits of information about an event and then filtering out the bits of information that you think are less important. So you're sort of combining these atomic decisions into higher level decisions. So I think this provides some sort of theoretical starting point for the types of questions and the types of decisions that we might be looking towards in algorithms as sort of consequential. People often talk about transparency as, it's kind of an in vogue response to dealing with these kinds of issues, and certainly a method that's often used by journalists to sort of build trust with the audience. In some cases, there may be voluntary incentives for corporations or governments to be transparent about how their algorithms work. Perhaps for PR reasons or to build trust with the public. But more often than not, we run into a couple of key challenges with trying to apply transparency to understand algorithmic power. So trade secrets, for one, this is kind of the idea that, hey, this is my proprietary thing. It's my special sauce. This is how I make money. There's no way I'm going to tell you how it works, because then you're going to go out and build a competitor to me. Unfortunately, this also bleeds over into the public sector. So, corporations, sure, they have trade secrets and they have a right to have trade secrets. Governments also use algorithms, but if you're trying to sort of use transparency to get at the kinds of algorithms that governments are using, you might run into this exception with the FOIA law, the Freedom of Information Act law, which would allow you to get at that information. But they, in fact, have an exception there where if the government is using third-party software in their own algorithms, in their own systems, they can say, hey, we're claiming this exception. We don't need to be transparent about how we're using this third-party stuff. There's also the issue of gaming and manipulation. So This is kind of the problem of if I start to tell you about exactly how the algorithm works, you can just manipulate it to your own game. So consider something like credit scores, where if I told you exactly how your credit score was computed, you could go out and start exhibiting different kinds of financial behavior that allow you to boost your credit score. There's this quote-unquote law, Goodhart's law, that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure, which is just to say that as soon as you tell people how something works, they're going to start manipulating it. The final challenge to using transparency here is really one of cognitive complexity. So, I mentioned before that algorithms can be very complex things, and the challenge here is really, how do you make transparency information understandable and accessible at the right time around an algorithm? Is the information integrated into the algorithmic output in some way? How do you make it easy enough to understand so that if you were going to integrate transparency information into an algorithm, someone could actually make sense of it and have it impact the kinds of their use of the algorithm, essentially? I think there's really a need for more research to look at usable transparency in this domain and figure out what are the key aspects of algorithms that we could make transparent, and then how would we present those in a way that helps people understand the algorithm. So this leads me to sort of a key point from the white paper, which is a more adversarial approach, right? We sort of had the theoretical approach, the transparency approach. Now we can imagine a reverse engineering approach, which gets at this idea of trying to extract the design blueprints from a man-made thing, the algorithm, and using observation and deduction to try and come up with a model of how that algorithm is working. This has the nice benefit of being able to detect side effects of the algorithm. So as a designer, I might have some particular intent of designing this algorithm, but when it goes out in the world, it starts interacting with real dynamics, and it might end up doing something that I didn't expect. So by trying to reverse engineer algorithms in their actual use environments, we have sort of this capability to try and detect side effects. That's not to say that also talking to designers and trying to get at issues of what are the design objectives and design intents isn't also important. I think that's key, and also something that journalists can really bring to the table in terms of reverse engineering algorithms, digging in, interviewing people, doing document analysis, and then combining that with a more technical reverse engineering approach. So let me give you an example. Well, let me just sort of present the model here for a second. So if you consider the algorithm as black box, what I failed to say before is that actually there's two little holes in every black box, right? There's a hole for the input to come into the algorithm and a hole for the output to go out of the algorithm. And the idea is that if you shoot enough different inputs into the algorithm and look at the outputs that correspond to those inputs, you can start doing correlations, and you can start building a theory or at least a story of what's going on inside that black box. It's a very low resolution sort of capability to see what's going on there, and certainly there's some challenges in terms of looking at correlation effects and making sure that you don't interpret those incorrectly. But I think it can sort of help us start uncovering a little bit more detail of what's going on. So there's this nice example that the Wall Street Journal published late last year, where they were actually doing some reverse engineering to look at this issue of price discrimination. So their question was, do different people pay different prices depending on their geography or their browser history? So depending on where you're loading, for instance, staples.com, do you see different prices? Or depending on the cookies in your browser and what other previous sites you visited online, does that affect the prices that get loaded on staples.com? And in fact, they looked at not just Staples, but a number of other different e-commerce sites, and they found that yes, in fact, there are correlations between geography and prices. So in this case, the input would be things like the geography and browser history, and that's getting passed through that black box, which is the staples.com website pricing algorithm, and on the outside and on the output side, they're recording the price that site was returning. So if you look at the map that they produced, hopefully you can see this. Dark gray is very low prices, dark green is very high prices, and you can sort of see the pattern of in Iowa of more urban areas have lower prices, and more rural areas tend to have the darker green prices. And in fact, if you zoom in here a little bit more and you overlay locations of staples versus competitors, you see, up north, there's a competitor to Staples, and you see lower prices. But out to the east of Des Moines, you see a little red dot where there's no competitors, where you have higher prices. And so this is sort of what you might expect, right? Where there's more competition, you have lower prices. Where there's less competition, higher prices. But what's interesting here is also that rural areas tend to be, more socioeconomically challenged, typically lower incomes. And so you have this promise of the internet that, the internet should sort of equalize the prices that people find online. But in reality, what you're seeing is that people who would tend to have lower incomes are actually getting charged higher prices because they're in more rural areas with less competition. So that's sort of an example of what I mean by reverse engineering here. I think there's a number of practical challenges to getting the reverse engineering to really work for journalists. So I think there's the challenge of identifying interesting algorithms and trying to figure out, what are the consequences and the significances of a particular algorithm, and does it warrant sort of a reverse engineering approach or a deep investigation into how it's working. We can ask questions about, is the algorithm discriminating against someone? Is it unfair in some way? Is it making it a mistake that's consequential? Is it censoring something that we find disagreeable? Is it breaking a law or a social norm? So we can talk about things like, can an algorithm defame you? There have been a number of cases around the world now where Google autocomplete, if you type in someone's name, it might say name/prostitute as the autocompletion. Well, people aren't too happy with being associated with prostitution, and so they've started suing Google over these kinds of things. You might also ask, well, did the algorithm make a prediction that turned out false? So there's at least, I think, a couple of dimensions where we might start looking for interesting stories here. At the end of the day, it's really about having an expectation for what the algorithm should be doing, and then looking for instances where the algorithm is sort of breaking with that expectation. There's a number of other challenges here too, including things like how do you sample this input-output relationship? That you could pass a lot of different types of inputs to algorithms, but which ones do you pass in? What's really your question that you're trying to answer? And I think that will help guide the things that you look at. And then, on the output side, once you've collected all of these outputs from an algorithm, it really does sort of turn into a data journalism challenge where you have this large data set that kind of represents all the output that's come out. And then the challenge is really, how do you find the story in that data that's been generated? How do you sort it? How do you find the important bits? And this, I think, also brings in, again, the importance of more traditional types of investigative reporting, interviewing people to try and uncover intent that might be apparent or not apparent, and doing other kinds of document analysis. So I'll just leave us with a couple points of discussion, and then we can sort of get into the critique and the broader discussion. But I just wanted to sort of mention a few challenges that I've been thinking about. So I think teaching journalists to do algorithmic accountability and reverse engineering is going to be challenging. Right now it's really messy and it's really hard to do. You need a lot of expertise, you need to know programming inside and out, and you need a lot of context on the system that you're trying to reverse engineer. So if you're looking at reverse engineering staples.com or any other web site, you really need to know a lot about internet architecture, about what the implications of that internet architecture are on what you're analyzing and what you're looking at. There's legal issues, so end user license agreements typically state that if you're going to use my service online, you can't reverse engineer it. You can't use it in that way. And so there's sort of an interesting question there of when are you willing to sort of cross that boundary? Are there other perhaps legal regulations that we need to consider that limit the ability of EULAs to prevent us from doing this kind of activity? There's other kinds of legal issues related to the DMCA, so you might want to think twice about trying to reverse engineer copyright technology, or when dealing with sensitive financial information. Other kinds of ethical implications, I think, relate to when is it okay to publish more information about an algorithm? I mentioned these issues of gaming and manipulation. I think we need to consider carefully, if we publish more information about an algorithm, how will stakeholders react to that information, and what will ultimately be the outcome for the public? If I tell you how Google ranks information, and you're an SEO person, you can go and then figure out how to get all kinds of spam ranked in my Google searches. I wouldn't consider that to be a very good outcome, so you might want to sort of consider what the ramifications are of publishing more information about these systems would be. I think there's some challenges with transparency, but there might also be a little bit of redemption here in moving forward, and I think that's something I'll be thinking about in future work, is how would you actually develop a transparency policy for algorithms? It's perhaps a little too early to do that now, but we might want to start thinking about what are the factors, what are the aspects of algorithms that we could make transparent, without getting down to the level of code or binary code, which I think is probably too much complexity. But what are sort of the higher level abstractions, the pieces of information that we could publish about algorithms? How frequently would we publish that information? What would be the format of that disclosure? Would the information be integrated into the algorithm, or would it be a monthly report? These kinds of things. I think these are all issues that we would need to work out to sort of develop a good transparency policy. And then finally, I just want to bring this back to journalism a little bit and say, as newsrooms start to use algorithms more in the newsroom itself for data mining or finding different stories in data, it's sort of an interesting tension with the journalistic ethic of transparency, right? So journalists, again, use transparency to develop trust with audiences as sort of a core ethical consideration. But as corporations, news corporations, they may be developing their own proprietary algorithms, and they might have their own trade secrets that they don't necessarily want to be transparent about because it would hurt their competitive ability. Does the public editor of the future sort of need to also act as an algorithmic ombudsman to tell the public, hey, these are the algorithms that we're using in the newsroom, and this is why you should trust the algorithms that we're building in the newsroom to help deliver the news to you. So with that, I will finish off and invite our panelists up to critique me. So come on up. I guess I probably need like one of those roasting stands or something. So who wants to start?
I guess I can start.
Okay.
So first, I read your white paper and I enjoyed it very much. There's a lot of interesting questions here. So my background is not as a journalist, but as someone who knows something about algorithms. So I just wanted to raise a few issues, maybe to clarify some things and raise some more questions. So first of all, to make the point that as we talk about algorithms, we have to realize that even before computers, we were using algorithms, and humans are using algorithms also. And so we're really looking at we don't want to focus on demonizing necessarily computer algorithms. And just as an example, now when you go to get a loan, there's some credit score done by some algorithm that does these weird things and gives you a number. Although the old system, right, was that you went to the banker, and the banker, him or herself, was using an algorithm also that we may or may not have liked, that may have taken into account, besides something about your finances, but did they know your family, what church did you go to, what your race was. So just that's the same world. It's just it's maybe a little, it may or may not be any more or less transparent. So we have some of the same issues. And so again, just to defend algorithms once, we shouldn't be blaming algorithms for the problem, just like we don't blame addition for the national debt, right? So anyway, so also just to, and you made this point somewhat, I just want to bring it out that if we're talking about algorithms, it's essential that we think about the complexity involved. So there's a technical sense in which any algorithm has a certain complexity, which I won't get into, but you really have to think about how complex, how complicated is the algorithm, as you mentioned, opaqueness, how much can you see into it? And also data, which I think you didn't talk about very much today, at least. The data is extremely important. What do we know about the data, and how does the algorithm evolve with the data? And this can be very important, right? That an algorithm run twice may produce different results, right? If you look at online advertising, you may go to a web page and there may be an ad, and you may go to the web page later and there may be a different ad, right? And so that's evolving because the data is evolving over time. And so I think that complicates the journalism task tremendously, because you may have some model of the algorithm, but it's even harder to know the data. Also, there's randomness in algorithms. They may make different decisions, which also is impossible to reproduce. And in general, I think this investigative task is going to be is important of reverse engineering, but is extremely difficult without, I think, the human part, the part you spoke about interviewing the people and understanding what's going on is essential, because if you just take an algorithm as a black box, I think you have no hope, unless it's something very simple, of understanding what's going on. You have to understand what the knobs might even be that they're thinking about, right? If you start with the abstract space of algorithms, it's hopeless. So I think you really, that's important, important undertaking. Also, I think the other, maybe I'll make this the last important message I want to take, is that we really have to understand what the limits are. It's not just that there are algorithms. We have to understand what the limits of the algorithms are. And the designers may understand this. It may even be public knowledge. But people, and this is a problem in society. This is a problem with people, within computer science also, not understanding what the limits of the models are. So if you look at the financial, some of the problems, and people were blaming, the financial models for some of the financial crisis that happened a few years ago, which is certainly true, but it's also true that the people who designed those models, when they designed them, were very aware of the limitations. And those limitations are out there in the public. They're not secret what they are. I mean, there are certainly secrets in the models, but it's pretty clear what some of the limitations are, but then people just use them, and use them without paying attention to what those limitations were. And that was a large source of the problem. And we're all guilty of this. We all use something, and you do a Google search, and you just believe that the most important thing comes up. But that's not the case, right? No one ever really claimed that that's the most important feature. If I search for your name, whatever comes up, that's the most important thing about you in the world. No one's really claimed that, but we all assume it. And so it's really important that as we use algorithms, we understand what the limitations are. And I think, and what the biases are, right? So, if we watch Fox News, we probably think we understand what some of the biases are, right? Or we watch, we read the New York Times, we think maybe we understand what the biases are. But of course, to take another example, when you hear a statistic, do you really understand what that really means? And there's a sort of a famous example that in the early days of AIDS testing, the test had something like a 0.1% error rate, right? And then, but if you go through the math, if you got a positive AIDS test, you probably didn't have AIDS, right? And that's all that information I just said is completely understandable, completely public, and no one understood it, right? And that leads to panic. And so who's to blame there? And so I think you really have to take that into account, in assigning blame. And so, when we see the output of an algorithm, do we really understand what it means? And I think it's really important to look at it in context. And so maybe I'll.
Yeah, thanks. Those were all really, really fantastic points. And I think especially your last point there about understanding algorithms in context, I think that's really definitely one of my aspirations and goals in working on this, is to try and get journalists thinking more about how to talk about the limitations of algorithms and understand algorithms, and help the public understand algorithms in a way that sort of frames them at the level that helps them make decisions about what these algorithms are doing. So I really appreciated that. Thanks.
Okay, I'm happy to go. So just a little word about my background, which is that after leaving mathematics, I worked at a hedge fund, D.E. Shaw, for a couple years, and I learned how to think like an asshole, which is really important in this context. And then I worked in ad tech, so I know a lot about like cookies and browsers and that kind of thing. And it's complicated and it's important, but it's important background for some of this. So I have a few points. I'm going to say them quickly because I really like the Q&A much more than like people talking. But so I'll just say them quickly and then provoke people hopefully to ask questions. The first point I want to make is I believe firmly that a gameable model is a bad model. It's a weak model. That means you're using proxies, which are not very good. Almost all models are gameable. They're almost all weak. But your example of, we don't want to make our model transparent because then people will game it. The example you used was credit scores. And I think that's kind of almost the perfect non-example for that. Ideally, credit scores are based on your behavior as a consumer. And if you were to game your credit score, that would mean you would pay your bills on time. And that's theoretically what you want. So I understand why the Experian or whatever the companies are don't want to make their models transparent because they make money off of them. But don't tell me it's because they don't want them gamed, unless you want to tell me that they're bad models. I wanted to talk a little bit more about transparency because I actually think in certain cases transparency is important. So for example, the most obvious case is in law. You should know what the law is. It's part of the Constitution that you know what the law is. But I do think that there's sort of like a spectrum of algorithms. Some of algorithms are so widespread. So there's three characteristics that I think if all three of these hold, then you should have transparency. So the three characteristics I think are crucial are high impact, high stakes, and widespreadedness. So if you have a model, an algorithm that's high stakes, like your job depends on it or your credit depends on it, it's high impact, it matters to you, and it's widespread, then it should be transparent because it's almost like a law in that situation. That's my argument. As I said, I'm not going to make full arguments, but so I do think transparency should, like the social need for understanding how important decisions are being made for society should sometimes transcend like proprietary urges or like trade secrets. Another good example of that, which was in your white paper but you didn't mention, is the value-added model for teachers. The value-added model for teachers is a black box algorithm that matters to teachers, often about whether they get tenure. Part of the Chicago teacher strike last year was based on the extent to which the value-added model should count. And it's a hugely political issue. That model sucks. It's like a black box that's really terrible, as you point out in your paper, and I'm like really happy to see that. That's a great example of something that absolutely should be transparent. And by the way, I just FOIA requested it like a couple days ago. So I'd love to work with some journalists.
What exactly did you FOIA request?
The actual source code.
Okay, great.
Another point I want to make is that the ability to reverse engineer models is actually severely limited for the most part. And you have some examples which are wonderful. I'm really glad they've been tried. I love the idea of reverse engineering models, like the price changes for staples was really interesting to me. But they're almost all consumer directed, and there's lots of models that are being used that we do not get to play with. A great example is like e-scores, like the electronic credit scores, which are being used more and more with peer-to-peer lending, or something like a monster.com like sorting algorithm for resumes. How are you going to reverse engineer that? I mean, I'd love for people to try, but I just want to point out that there's lots of non-consumer facing models which are important, that are hard to reverse engineer. But actually, that's not to say that looking at the output of a black box is not really important and interesting anyway. Like sometimes you can see the output, you can't necessarily put the input in as many times as you want to figure out the output. That's reverse engineering makes it seem like you have the box to play with. You can put in a bunch of inputs to sort of understand what happens inside and get the various outputs. But you could also just collect outputs, and that's sometimes really important. it's not true that you need to understand the algorithm, explicitly as a code or as a, as a mathematical formula to understand something about the algorithm. And that is sort of one of my biggest points, which is that people have, the coders who code the algorithms, let's just talk about the Google search algorithm. The coders who code the algorithms have a very different understanding of an algorithm, say the search algorithm, than the people who use the search algorithm. And it comes down to the question of fairness, of like racism, so there's been a few examples where people think that they've kind of given examples of the Google search algorithm being racist. We could talk about that. But of course, there is no Google engineer inside Google who has a little subroutine called be racist, And it's really important to not try to pretend that's happening. There's no intent. So this goes to your last issue, which is like, interview the coders about their intent. Okay, you could do that, but a lot of these are unintended consequences. And so I would argue that as journalists, our job is twofold, and they'll stop after this. First is to make sure that everyone understands this is not an objective activity. You don't end up with, like, an algorithm isn't an objective thing. It's a human manufactured thing, which has all sorts of weird, buggy things and unintended consequences. The other thing I want to urge journalists to do is to absolutely insist that understanding an algorithm doesn't mean understanding the code. It means understanding how people experience that algorithm. And that's a perfectly reasonable definition of understanding the algorithm. And it is probably much more important to the journalist audience than the code itself, which is, after all, even when you have transparent code, it's only actually readable to a very small fraction of the people. And that's not to say I don't want the Google search algorithm to be open sourced, but how useful would that be? You'd never find like you might find a smoking gun, but I would be very surprised to find one. Thank you.
I guess I lost my... Is this microphone on? Oh, yeah. Fascinating stuff. Thanks for the feedback, Kathy. As I struggle with my mic here, I'm just gonna transition over here into more panelist mode. You made a lot of really great points, and I'm really fascinated by this struggle between the balance between trade secret and transparency. And I don't know, maybe you could go into a little bit more detail on how you think that might be negotiated, or in what situations you think that's important.
So just one caveat, like I'm an occupier, so
okay.
I'm not politically feasible, and I don't aim to be. I'm sort of speaking from the perspective of someone who's like, yeah, we're never going to convince people who have proprietary trade secrets or algorithms, we're never going to convince them to like give up their credit scoring model for free, or the Google search algorithm for that matter. However, it is a social good, and or bad. But the point is that it has power. It has arguably an immense amount of power over the public and over their lives, and in that sense, it should, sort of morally speaking, be transparent. That's what I'm saying. And I know it would take a different government than we have now to make that happen. Right now, the regulation in terms of algorithms is non-existent. So I'm not holding my breath. I'm just saying what I think should happen.
I think that the ability to game it has to be taken into account, right? So if the Google search algorithm were public, it might become useless, right? Because now you'd have everyone trying to spam it and get to the top.
Actually, it's a great point.
I think that's more interesting to me that's more important to me than the legal, the legal point.
I actually think the Google search algorithm, for all intents and purposes, is open sourced right now. In the following sense, I really don't think it would make sense to have the code base. It's millions of lines of code. It only works on the one grid that Google owns. Like, what would you do with it? Right now, what you have is the ability to run searches all you want with all the cookies you want to establish. I mean, you actually can reverse engineer the Google search algorithm as it stands. And people are gaming it all the time. There's a whole industry called SEO, which is gaming Google search. I mean, it's a modeling war, one of many modeling wars. But So Google search is kind of a bad example of what I think should be transparent, because I think it kind of already is. Credit scoring is a great example of something, and the teacher value-added model are examples of things I think really should be transparent.
You know, I would agree with that.
Okay, maybe we should let Scott have a say.
The journalist gets the final say. I'm the sort of token English major on the panel, which I'm very pleased with. You know, I really enjoyed the paper, and you know, when you're reading these things, you sort of wonder what you're going to say, and you know, it's very different to read these things, not only when you're mentioned in it, but when you're, you know, kind of going to be asked to talk about it. So thanks for inviting me, Nick. I wanted to talk briefly. I'm Scott Klein. I work at ProPublica. I run a team of developer journalists. So we are journalists and developers both, and we're kind of all in the same brain, software engineers and data journalists. And over the years, we have done projects that sort of try to ask questions using software. So, you know, we very early on did a project that tracked changes on the whitehouse.gov site, which the Barack Obama campaign had become the Barack Obama administration. They were just starting to relaunch whitehouse.gov. And we started a project where we were tracking changes to it and reporting out these changes on Twitter and letting people see the changes to see if they were consequential or not. So really from very early on in ProPublica's existence and in my department's existence, we've been trying to get our computers to do our work for us. The project that Nick talks about in his paper is a project that we did during the most recent presidential election, in which we had gotten, there were many stories that were talking about the incredible sophistication of the Obama campaign's data operation, that it was going to be unprecedentedly large, it was going to be sophisticated beyond all imagining, and they were going to be able to target people down to their fingernail color, even as it changed, and be able to tell you all sorts of things about their likeliness to vote for Barack Obama, and it was really going to change things. And being software engineers, we sort of said, well, I wonder if we can reverse engineer that. I wonder if we can, by watching the outputs, if this is something that we could kind of figure out how it's working. And we sort of had that in mind as a project we might do. And then Dan Sinker, who's a friend of ours, who some people here may know, who runs the Open News Project at Mozilla, which I also cheer, tweeted one Friday night because his wife had received an email from the Obama campaign about, I think it was dinner with Mariah Carey, or it was something like that. And he received an email almost simultaneously inviting him to look at all the new technologies available on the My Barack Obama website. And he said, well, this is strange. I'm a boy, and I got a technology email, and my wife's a woman, and she got an email about a celebrity. I wonder if anybody else is seeing this. So he tweeted out to his friends, hey, everybody send me your emails. I want to see, you know, who got what. And we jumped onto this as well. I saw the tweet. I said, hey, we would love to help you analyze that if you have no other plans for it. He said, I didn't think past the tweet. Sure, I'll do it. So he forwarded all the emails to us. We retweeted it the next Monday morning. We got, I think, a couple of thousand responses. And we started looking into what are the differences between the people who got these emails. That was just kind of a sort of a straight, I think, text comparison. We built, over time, a much larger project where in real time we were asking people to send us their emails from all of the campaigns. And if you sent us an email from the campaign, we sent you an email back surveying, asking things, actually some pretty sophisticated, some pretty detailed questions. Your income, your gender, your likeliness to vote, whether you had donated before, your age, and things like that. And started doing some sophisticated data analysis, far more sophisticated than I can do, but I have a developer on my team who worked for a year at this, trying to reverse engineer the algorithm that the campaign might have been using, given that we knew some of the inputs. We knew how much money you make, we knew how old you were, we knew what state you lived in, we knew all sorts of things about you, and then we can sort of compare, you know, you got this email at 8 o'clock, this person got this other email at 8 o'clock, what's the difference between you, what's the difference between these emails? And we ran we created what we called a beautiful machine to try to figure out if we could in real time reverse engineer these and send you an email back saying, hey, the reason you got this email and not this other email is because, it might be because you were a man, or it might be because you were in Tennessee. So we spent a good bit of time on that. Nick points out in one of the interesting kind of mistakes we made, and it's not in the, was not in the sort of software work we did, but simply in how we described it. We noticed an effect in one email, which was that significantly age seemed to be a factor determining who got what of one particular email. And we infelicitously wrote that this email was targeted to older people. I will tell you, and this kind of factors in later, the Obama campaign was never cooperated with us, even way after the election, before they would even talk to us. And I think the reasons for that are obvious. The only thing, in fact, they would tell us is, well, these are big secrets for us, and we don't want the other side to know. We can't talk to you. We're not going to talk to you. That was sort of the nicest way they ever put it. When they would talk to us at all. But so the one thing they said to us afterward was, well, we were never targeted by age. That was wrong. And we looked back and we said, how did we get this wrong? And we had, and also part of the conversation, actually part of another article, it turned out that they had been targeting by previous donation. And because there was a correlation between previous donation and age, we were observing a correlated effect and not the effect itself. And in this sort of one clause in one sentence in one article said it the wrong way and turned out to have been the wrong one to do it. Everywhere else we were much more careful and much more guarded about our kind of correlation versus causation. So that was kind of what we, just kind of in defense of my reporter. But it seems to me that it's a good segue into the more general point I want to make, which is when we as journalists start approaching these things in a naive way. I mean, in other words, we don't have a source who is telling us all the answers, and then we just have to, corroborate that source and get documents and find out more about it, then publish it. When we have much less access to the original material, is that we should live by Richard Feynman's principle that you should never fool yourself, and that you're the easiest person to fool. So we have to be very, very careful. And this is why I liked, Nick's got a section on methodological transparency. And I'm a sort of an amateur historian when it comes to data journalism, and I've got an example that I'm happy to send you from 1973, one of the very earliest days of computer-assisted reporting, in which the New York Times published sort of a huge page of statistics. Looks like a giant Excel spreadsheet in 1973, but there's a box on the page as well. That is the embodiment of what the nerd boxes that all of us now put on our big data stories, and it explains exactly the methodology that went into the gathering and the explanation of the data. So I think that it is not only is it important that in journalism that we explain our methodology and our algorithm, but I would say that it's not actually optional. I think that if I read, I don't want to take a news story's word for it. I'd like to hear how they did it, and I think it's a requirement that we are transparent about it for our readers. We have done methodology boxes on our stories that include, mathematical formulas. I mean, yes, that may be kind of over the head of every single reader, but it still has to be right, and there's someone out there who can read it and say, no, you screwed this up. This isn't correct. This isn't how you apply this. So I think that's not optional. And another thing that's not optional, there's one of my bosses at ProPublica, his expression is, you should never be surprised to see your name in the paper. So we never do anything in my team or any other teams at ProPublica. We never conjecture, well, first we never conjecture, but we never kind of do reporting about something and then not give the person about whom we are reporting a chance to respond, a chance to comment, and hopefully a chance to tell us we're wrong. And as journalists, we have to go into that conversation open-minded and hopeful that, and happy if they tell us we're wrong and can prove it. It is not simply, as you may have in your head, this idea that you kind of call and say, I know you did this, and they say, I don't know what they scream and hang up, I'm not talking to you. No, you really do hope that they challenge your assumption, because we are, and this is my sort of a third point, is we are not witnesses. We were not there. We don't, on some level, all of journalism is reverse engineering, right? We have some of the inputs, we have some of the outputs, You know, someone there told us how something happened, maybe, but that was only one person. They've got one point of view. We need to go find other people. Just like all reverse engineering, the more inputs you can do, the better the accuracy of your output is going to be. So in a way, all journalism is reverse engineering. So, you know, we also call, none of the stories that I've ever done using reverse engineering did we not also call the White House or the campaign, even if they never spoke to us. And we called and were honest with them about wanting to hear if we were right or wrong, and perfectly willing to not publish if we were wrong. I mean, that's sort of my broadest point. I mean, one final point, which you talked a bit about ethics, and actually the people who did the project in the Wall Street Journal on the Staples project are here tonight. It's an interesting thing to see who grapples, you know, how we're sort of solving these problems and how we're grappling with this. We made the decision when we were doing the Obama project or the election project that we would not create straw users, that we would not approach this experimentally, because we couldn't, because we felt that would be holding ourselves out as non-journalists and kind of going undercover, and we were uncomfortable with that. So we didn't say, I'm Joe Smith, and I live in Topeka, Kansas, and I'm a construction worker, and then see what emails I got, which would have been, I think, we've gotten much more kind of interesting responses. That actually turns out that Kathy's right. That was ungameable, because as we now know, they were actually matching that up with voter rolls, and they were matching that up in the Obama campaign. It was matching it up with voter rolls. They were matching it up with all sorts of purchase information, all sorts of offline information. So they would have known almost instantaneously that there's no Joe Smith in Topeka, Kansas, whoever voted for a Democrat, and we probably would have fallen off all of their algorithms. So it wouldn't have worked. But at the time, we didn't know that. But we made the decision not to approach it experimentally, not to make straw users. The folks at the Wall Street Journal, and that project is incredible. The Staples pricing project, kind of requiring you to kind of become people from different parts of Iowa to see what kind of pricing you got. These are some of the most ethical and best journalists I know. So it's interesting to me, where are we going to come out on that? Because I don't see that as kind of ethically beyond any line. But if you try to match it to to an older model of journalism where you don't want to do anything that even sort of seems like you're pretending not to be who you are, it's an interesting question to me that you raised in the piece, and I don't know where to go with that. But.
Can I respond to that for a sec?
Yeah.
Because I think in terms of modeling wars, and I mean, okay, I'm not a journalist, so I don't have the ethics of a journalist, but I do feel like, in a very arguable sense, we, the public, are in a war against these algorithms that make us pay more if they think we're rural. And so I actually blogged about that specific article, which I loved, and a lot of the comments were like, well, you can't blame them for trying. And I'm like, well, maybe you can't blame Staples for trying, but you can't blame me as a consumer for fighting back and changing my address on my IP, pretending I'm near a competitor. So why are we doing that? And I feel like the ethics there are like, we're already in a fight. We should be part of that. Maybe not as a journalist, but certainly as a consumer.
I feel a little bit less strongly. To me, my role as a journalist is to try to explain these phenomena to people, to give them the information they need to make decisions and to live their lives. And I think that exposing this as a thing that you don't know about and trying to help you understand how it might work, I think that's the kind of highest goal of journalism.
So, Kathy, I also wanted to sort of dip back into something you said, which was that I think you said something along the lines of, well, really the reverse engineering is rather limited because there's a lot of algorithms that aren't public facing and they're sort of behind some kind of wall where you can't manipulate the inputs to the algorithm, but that might still be interesting to look at the outputs. And I wanted to sort of connect that back into some of the stuff that Scott was talking about, where you really do sort of see a kind of a hybrid investigation where the output side was the emails that had been generated from the campaign. And they couldn't actually manipulate the inputs to that algorithm, but they could sort of synthesize it or collect or crowdsource it, I guess in this case, to come up with some kind of synthetic input that they could then correlate to the output. And so, even though not all these things are public facing, there might still be some interesting things if we have an output set and we can figure out how to kind of simulate the input set.
I think that's a great example of something where you can collect outputs and piece together stuff, and it's wonderful. I just want to make another example, put out another example to make it clear that it's difficult in certain cases. So there are these electronic credit scores, which I think are really pretty horrible. They're not, since there's laws about how you're allowed to use credit scores, they're not allowed to be used exactly for a credit decision. They're called e-scores. Let's just call them e-scores. They're based on everything you've ever done. So Axiom, which is a data warehousing on the web, has like profiles of everybody in the country. They use that kind of information, and they're not, as I said, they're not allowed to actually, so a credit card company has e-scores in addition to credit scores when they're actually deciding whether to give someone a credit card and what the terms would be on that credit card. But what they use the e-scores for are things like how long to put you on hold for before you get to talk to a customer service representative. So your phone number is enough information for Axiom to say profile, bad credit risk, just keep them on hold forever. I don't know how you'd crowdsource that, because I don't know how you'd find out who even called that credit card company. See what I'm saying? So it's very like, it was a great example of how you can't really game that model, but you can figure out you can tweet and say, who's doing this? What was your email? Send it to me, tell me your characteristics. But there's lots of models where you can't even find the people that were subject to the model.
That's a really good point. Thanks. Questions from the audience? Do we want to open it up? Give people a minute. Please grab the.
What is the value-added thing with teachers? I missed that. What does that mean?
Very shortly, it's a way of trying to measure the value that was added by a given teacher. And the underlying model is, if you have a bunch of students in the classroom, you have a model that tries to predict what they're going to get on the year-end standardized tests. And the extent to which a given teacher in a classroom has students do better than what they're expected to do, or worse, that's the value added, the difference between those. And it's theoretically not a terrible idea, but the problem turns out to be that it's just not very, it doesn't have very much signal. It's very noisy. One of the reasons you might think it's noisy is it's a difference between two models in some sense, and it's sort of, but in any case, one of the problems is that it doesn't really have an evaluation metric. It's not being compared to other ways of measuring teachers, at least not publicly. So it's already very suspicious that you have this model where the score is the score, and that's what it is, and you can't look into how you got the score, and you also can't compare it to like a qualitative assessment for teachers. It's sort of an unproven model.
Yeah, the Los Angeles Times did 2 or 3 years ago now, maybe longer. They used the value-added model. It's a thing. It's not but Chicago didn't make it up. I don't know who made it up, but the Los Angeles Times did the calculation for teachers in Los Angeles. It was very controversial. It was a terrific set of stories. It won lots of awards. It created an interesting conversation about the model, about the idea of scoring teachers like this in Los Angeles. That makes for an interesting read. The conversation it started was very interesting. The teachers hated it, I guess, is the short way of saying that.
Do you want to jump in?
Sure. So you mentioned credit score, which is definitely something that impacts a lot. Sorry, impacts. But it seems likely that predictive policing and other similar kinds of algorithmic approaches to government regulation are going to have significant impacts for the public sector, not just the private sector. The SEC might get into trying to reverse engineer the algorithms by traders, for instance. A lot of them. Tracking down both of those things seems to me to be beyond
Excuse me. For the back of the room,
Sorry.
can you repeat that?
Yep,
Thanks.
sorry. The whole thing, or did?
Summarize it.
Okay, sorry about that. Doc Searles? Yeah. Hey, Doc, nice to see you. So to go backtrack a little bit, you mentioned credit scores. The public sector is also going to use algorithms to do things like predictive policing to apply elsewhere. Redlining is a common idea. So is it within the capacity of newsrooms to do the kind of reverse engineering that's needed to hold the public sector accountable, to hold police departments accountable, or will they have to do partnerships with academia or with other kinds of organizations to do that kind of work?
I can take that. I mean, ProPublica, we are well funded, and we're incredibly honored to be gotten the trusted investment of so many nonprofit funders, and we are comfortable. But we have a lot smaller budget than most metro papers in the United States. So I bristle at the notion that a newsroom can't do this, but ProPublica can, because we're like 30 people on a floor near Wall Street. And that would make us completely infinitesimal newsroom compared to most metro newsrooms. So I don't like the idea, never like the idea that, papers can't do this. On the other hand, we talk to academics at ProPublica all the time. This is this sort of a journalism academic nexus. I mean, when we did our project on the campaigns, we were in regular contact with, reading academic papers, calling the people who wrote those papers, hey, I'm going to use your algorithm to try to figure out if this is how they're targeting emails. Is that an appropriate way to use your algorithm? Thanks. We had a conversation with them. So I think that partnering with academia is great, and we want to do it as much as we can. But I think that it is well within the fraud detection, things like that are well within almost every newsroom's budget and reach, as long as they're willing to make that choice.
So just to jump in there for a second, in the white paper that's coming out next month, I talk about a number of examples of reverse engineering in journalism that have happened in newsrooms, as well as a number that have happened in academic circles. So academics publishing, studies of reverse engineering algorithms in academic venues and sort of research papers. And so you sort of see this methodology emerging in sort of both places. And I think what's sort of lacking from the academic approach oftentimes is this notion of interviewing the designers or really talking to people who built the algorithms. The academic approach tends to take a more distanced approach toward looking at these objects, whereas the journalistic approach, I've noticed, takes a more active and sort of investigative and interviewee kind of approach. And I'd sort of love to see a convergence between those two things, and I definitely see interest on both sides for that.
Yeah, I think it's partly cultural that you think that a news organization shouldn't hire such people. I think more and more organizations are realizing they need to, and it's not just I want my students to have jobs, right? But besides that, I'm saying that for example, the SEC is finally realizing, I think, that having so many lawyers, maybe you need people who actually understand finance, right? And so it's a cultural thing, right? The SEC is, I don't know what the percentage is, largely lawyers. They hire other lawyers, so I think there's something maybe journalists aren't thinking about hiring people with technical expertise, but I think that people need to take some action and bring people in, and it will change things.
We also have done stories, not quite reverse engineering, but we've done stories about using purely government data, and we've tried to not do fraud detection in the sort of technical sense, but but sort of detect outliers. We did a project about that used Medicare Part D prescription data. We were the first newsroom to get that data. And we kind of looked to see if we could find, who are the doctors who are prescribing the most drugs to seniors that are on a list of dangerous drugs to seniors. Simple stuff, right? This is matching. I mean, I guess to the extent that matching is an algorithm, it was an algorithm. To the extent that Max is an algorithm, we've kind of found that the doctors who are doing the most non-generic brand name prescriptions, for drugs that have easily available and bioequivalent generics. And then went out and met these doctors and tried to figure out why they were doing that. That is something we were using one organization's data set. We were using CMS's data set. This is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And they are the largest budget government agency in America, bigger than the military. So we know they've got the resources to hire whoever they want. We were doing these things, and what our story said was this CMS could be doing these things too. We had one case where a doctor was prescribing, I'm not going to get the details right, but was prescribing a tremendous, tremendous number of prescriptions, far more than one person really could. It turned out that there was an explanation because doctors in his practice were prescribing under his license. But what the interesting thing that he told us was that CMS had never contacted him to ask why he was prescribing so many drugs. So the SEC is at a certain disadvantage relative to CMS because they don't have the balance sheets and access to they don't have all of the information. CMS has absolutely all of the inputs. And it wouldn't take Kathy O'Neill to really find people they should call and try to figure out what's going on. At least not in the first kind of couple of months. But so there are government agencies that absolutely should be doing some of these things and more.
Can I also respond just very shortly? First of all, I'm very positive in the sense that I learn a lot about some of these creepy algorithms, I call them creepy models, from journalists. So in some sense, journalists are doing an excellent job, partly because people are really proud of these models and they don't see the creep. The other thing I wanted to mention is, because I was offered a job by the SEC actually I applied for a job in 2009. They didn't seem to want anyone except lawyers and some economists. I feel like to some extent a lot of the stuff that's going on is really proprietary. So I'm not sure. So the bad news is I'm not sure how helpful it is necessarily to talk to academics. Sometimes you got to talk to the people who are doing the models in industry, and they're not talking. So maybe sometimes you need to find kind of a whistleblower situation. And because modelers know what they're doing, they often know what's creepy about their model. But I don't necessarily think that's reverse engineering. That's a different kind of journalism, more like investigative journalism with looking for whistleblowers.
Hanging out at the bar and looking for tips, right?
One of the reasons I find it so interesting to work in data science is I hear what is actually going on there, and it's creepier than anything you read about.
We have another question? Yeah, Michael.
I had a question on what you meant by there not being intent or not reading intent into algorithms. Because some of them, I think, might, at the heart of them, have some type of whitelist. I've heard of some discussions about news aggregation algorithms that, at the heart of it, have authorial news sources. And so there might be an intention to deliver people news that doesn't come from blogs that might be conspiracy blogs, things like that. Would you consider that an intent, or did you mean more generally that we should caution against reading an intention into that type of design?
So for me, I would say that there's let's put it this way. Lots of my friends are Google engineers. And so when I talk to them, I've just noticed that when you talk to a Google engineer about, is this Google search racist? They're just like, what are you talking about? They're offended. They're personally offended. So you have to set it up very carefully. You have to say, look, I'm not talking about what you intended. I'm talking about the experience of different people coming to your website. Just because one guy lives in Harlem, one guy lives in Stanford, that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Great. Two related questions and hopefully quick questions. First, I guess the question is for Scott, and you were saying that you're very hesitant for various reasons relating to journalistic ethics to make strong claims about causes. But I wonder what's wrong with actually just focusing on effects. So in particular, we might not have any sense of, to take your example with age, you got it wrong, or apparently the campaign says you got it wrong. But in fact, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe what you care about is the fact that people are being presented with different ads according to age. And it might be because of some other proximate cause, but actually what we care about is that age actually determines what you see. So what's the problem, I think, then, with actually trying to focus just on effects and be less obsessed with actually trying to figure out the cause? And the second question, which is related, is I really do think it's a big problem that we're often holding the algorithm up as a kind of individual thing, when in fact it's almost always the interaction between the algorithm and the data set. And in particular, we are interested in trying to figure out what the factors are that determine some particular outcome. But in many cases, it's that you write some algorithm and then you let it loose on a huge data set, And even though you have some sense of what the factors are, you don't know what kind of results that will generate, especially when you're going to do something that involves machine learning. So my sense is that we need to kind of be attentive to the limitations that this interaction presents for reverse engineering, but the solution could be focusing simply on what the effects are, right? That's I don't know, yeah.
Yeah, I actually agree with you, and what I was trying to say was that was essentially mostly what we did was just sort of described more people who lived in Kentucky got this email versus this other email. The only times that we ventured deeply into real causes was when it was an email about how the candidate was going to be in Kentucky, and we said, well, obviously they only want people in Kentucky to know that. So. However, there is a sort of journalistic, impetus to explain why. So we want to say why these things happened. So it's a tension. I mean, it was important for us not to let ourselves mix up correlation and causation, and we were very careful in all of the ways that we described the work and very careful in how we described all of the findings. We had a very high bar for significance. We were really concerned about these things. But we ultimately wanted to tell people, we promised them that we would try to explain to them why they got this email and their wife got this other email, or why they got this email and their neighbor got a different email. So even when you frame that as just giving them the effects and not the causes, you are still implying, usually pretty strongly, what the cause was. So it was the age problem, and you're right, it doesn't really matter. It just turns out that they didn't know they were targeting by age, but it turns out they were targeting by age because they were targeting by some strongly correlated factor. Just quickly, I mean, just from my point of view, it's just a question of framing, and ultimately I agree with you, and we tried to stick to that.
I mean, I certainly think that there is a danger of correlation, equaling causation, and personally, I think it's important to understand some of the mediating variables that might be inside that box that sort of impact the effects. I think it's also important to remember that correlation does not equal intent, right? So just because an effect is correlated with some other input, that doesn't mean that it was done intentionally. It could be a sort of unintended side effect.
Yeah, journalism in general, as an editor, you try to edit out when a reporter tries to say what was going on in someone's head, or even comes even close to it, or just even the way he writes a sentence makes it as though he knows what someone was thinking, because you never know what somebody was thinking. Even if they tell you what they were thinking, you probably don't know.
I mean, I think the question of the data set that's fed in is also a fascinating one, and also sort of ties into Michael's question too, in terms of the design intent. What kind of data set was fed into the algorithm as a bootstrap, as a starting point for the algorithm to start learning. So I did a story reverse engineering Google and Bing autocompletions, and I was interested in sort of the editorial criteria that were being used to block certain suggestions along the lines of child pornography, for instance. And when you look at these things and you start to find mistakes in what's getting censored and what's not, of course you have to reach out to Google and Bing and talk to them and ask them, did you mean for this to happen? What's going on with your algorithm? And there's a pretty strong corporate rhetoric, at least at Google and also at Bing, to say that it's the algorithm, like there's no people involved in this, and it's all very objective. It's running on servers, blah blah blah, and it's like, yeah, no, but there's people who made decisions somewhere along the line, and oh wow, you have a committee that meets every month to talk about how the algorithm is going to change. And if you really sort of drill into that, what you get to is, yeah, there's an engineer somewhere who decided there was a blacklist of pornography terms that were going to be used as an input to start training this algorithm. And really, I think what the reporting can help you get at is trying to get access to some of that stuff. What is the sort of the starting conditions for the design of the algorithm? And I think if you can connect that back into an observation of the effect, if that's sort of a reverse engineering kind of approach, then I think you have a much stronger and more interesting story. Any other questions out there? Questions. People are thinking. Another.
Well, I mean, I have many, many questions, so forgive me. But I can't even remember if this was something that Kathy posted a long time ago. But it is interesting to me that insurance pricing models are reviewed at the state level. I mean, is this something, Kathy, that you wrote about? I can't remember.
I've certainly talked about insurance, but I don't know about this specific.
Okay, so as far as I understand, actually, insurance pricing models are actually regulated, and it's done at a state level, and there are state officials who will review the model. And my understanding, too, is that the industry has been very unhappy with this practice because it often means that it has to be of a complexity that is not in excess of what humans can understand. So it places kind of like a natural limit on the model. And I wonder if this is something that might be an interesting example to see some of these interesting tensions between transparency and regulability.
Yeah, I'd like to address that. I mean, as a person working in industry, let me just say that there's plenty of models that could just be a simple logistic regression, but it would sound too cheap. So we add a bunch of like neural networks and random forests, and we mix it up because it's like, wow, that sounds really proprietary. So there's definitely value in obfuscation as a general rule, and that's a really important point. And you have to understand, of course, and in the case of insurance, especially in case of like important high-impact models like insurance, right? The interests of the public are very different from the interests of the insurer. And so they're always going to argue for as much complexity as they can possibly have so they can hide whatever they want to get rid of people who will reduce their Medicare star rating, for example. Something I've learned recently about, which is really creepy. So then you have to, so we have to, I'm glad to hear about this. I didn't even know about this. I'm glad state officials go over this, and I'm hoping that they're really thinking about it in the public's interests. And so that if they are, they're going to say, look, interpretability of your model, which also, by the way, is maybe what you read on my blog was there's a rule about credit card decisions, which is that you have to be able to be explained why you didn't get a credit card if you're refused a credit card. So that's part of the law, and I think that's really great. Yes, it means that the model isn't as exact as the modeler wants, but it means that it has to be out in the open. There's a kind of transparency there, which is in the public's interest.
So, so coming back to sort of something that Cliff said earlier, he sort of implored us not to demonize algorithms, and I think that's actually an important point. Because, in some sense, nothing has changed. Scott said also that, all of journalism is reverse engineering. So, if everything's the same, then what's different? And I sort of wanted to pose that to the panelists as a question. What's different about the environment that we're operating in now? Clearly we have algorithms that were, operated, by people in the past. Now we're moving toward a more automated society. Reverse engineering, you could think of science as reverse engineering and looking at input-output relationships. And in fact, that's kind of what I'm proposing in the white paper is a much more scientific approach to the study of artificial systems. So I don't know, maybe reflect.
I mean, I think it's news stories, news sources. The computer-assisted, or one of the traditional computer-assisted reporting maxims is, you should interrogate the data. And you should treat data like a source, by which it is meant. Don't trust it. Don't trust it as verify it and make sure you understand it. Make sure you know its limitations, its point of view, its biases. So in a way, it is just new sources. New ways of asking things about those sources, new sources for data, for stories. So.
I mean, what's changed, one is the complexity, right? We believe we could understand the decisions a human makes, although that may or may not be true. But with an algorithm, you can get to a level of complexity that we don't understand. And I think also we have a different emotional reaction to human decisions versus a decision coming from a computer. And it sort of cuts both ways. I mean, I think if you look at college admissions over time, right? I mean, if you go back, I don't know, 50, 70, 80 years, maybe you were admitted, again, just based on, who you were, or the money your family had, or the connections you had, and that led to the introduction of the SAT to be a more people then felt better about a more standard way of admitting people, something that wasn't subject to human bias. But then at some point, I think, then some people sort of say, well, the SAT actually favors certain groups, so we put the human, back into the decision. So, I mean, it cuts both ways. We have to realize that we just, at a gut level, feel differently about a human versus computer decision.
Let me add another aspect, which is scalability. It's certainly true that we had algorithms, and I think credit decisions, as your example, was a great one. And probably almost all of the credit decisions when it was made by a human being at a small local bank were racist, for example. So I'm not saying that you can't have like problems with all human models, but one of the things that's weird about nowadays, like a Facebook model, when an algorithm is thrown onto Facebook, it is hugely scaled. And my opinion is that almost all models are deeply flawed. So that flaw is affecting everyone in the entire world. So that's the kind of thing where it's immediately huge, which isn't true in old-fashioned algorithms.
Yes, question in the back.
Yeah, that actually is perfectly into the question that I was going to ask about is, why can't people have algorithms? I mean, what we need is, I think, a nonprofit that will create algorithms that people can use. I mean, the corporations have all the lawyers, they have all the, all the power on that side, and now they have the algorithms too. So it just seems to me like, are there simple ways that people can start to play with data sets or even demand data sets? Like there are a lot of government data sets that are out there. Why couldn't people who are interested play with it? Healthcare, another thing. So, just an idea.
I think you need to join Occupy Data because, yeah, I mean, certainly I agree with you. Like, first of all, there is a lot of open data, although the open data is often not the most interesting data. And the most interesting data is often not open. But yeah, as I alluded to before, I believe that people should have algorithms to get their cookies and their browser settings to be maximally optimized for them so that they don't have to pay extra. Why doesn't that exist? Well, it doesn't exist because no one's paid to make it, but it could be made for sure.
Let's kickstart it. Another question up here?
Yeah, well, kind of leading off that last point, it sounds like, I mean, some of the things ProPublica has been doing is creating tools that the public can interact with, such as, is your doctor being paid by a pharmacy company? And I'm wondering, like, that is an incredible form of public service, and will that continue as a form of journalism? Creating tools that the public could use to better learn about their world.
If I have anything to say about it, it will. We are now 10 people building as many of those as we can every year. We're, going to do a smaller one tomorrow. We're publishing something, but yeah, we do as much of that as we can, and to some extent, one of the roles of journalism is to be, like the person in the back was saying, the public's algorithm. We are a service to our readers, and we represent you, and like you were saying, you could, if you wanted to, as a developer in your basement, scrape 15 pharmaceutical department websites and then start running searches against all of the data that comes out, or you could, get your local news organization to do that for you. And so I do see that as a key role for journalism going forward forever. And we're going to do it as much as we humanly can, and try to get others to do it as well.
So I have a quick question. I wonder if when we're talking about the algorithms, we're not kind of mystifying agency here a little bit. So if we get away from computers, if I let my car run down the hill and rig the wheel in some way that hurts people, that kind of projectile that I launch with some pathway, the agency there is pretty clear. The law is fairly unambiguous that if the car hurts someone, it's my fault. Similarly, when I launch an algorithm that manages to later insult you, it seems that there is a clear, someone created it, somebody launched it, and just the fact that it's kind of has some measure of autonomous life, that shouldn't really diminish the agency of the person who launched it. So that's my first kind of comment. And my second comment, it seems like in the news recently, the algorithms in the news because they have unintended consequences in complex systems, right? So you have the stock market where there are multiple algorithms, and the people who have launched these kind of projectiles, they did not anticipate the results of an ecosystem of algorithms kind of fighting with each other, right? And there the agency is more modeled. And I think the real question here is about regulation. What kind of laws can we envision that would address kind of the more difficult modeled cases of algorithmic agency and accountability? So I wonder, the question here is about accountability, about regulation. What do you envision some kind of legislature that could address the complexity of the problem?
I think that's a fascinating question. I mean, it really gets to the heart of, when we have systems of algorithms interacting, when Skynet goes live, what laws do we have in place to regulate them? Well, it wouldn't matter in that case, but if we're talking about, unphysical bots that are running around online and social media, maybe there is sort of a role for regulation to play. I'm going to punt on that. I don't really know, to be honest, but it's definitely something to think about some more, and it's something I will think about. And maybe I need to go back and get a JD now or something.
I can't answer your question, but I just want to point out from your example some of the complexity of it, because you were very, you were very clear in the first example it was the person, but you could argue it's either the car or the person, right? But you came down on one side. In the second example, there was the algorithm, but then there was also the algorithm was insulting you, but someone entered some data that the algorithm used to insult you, and you came down on the side of, it was the algorithm and not the data. And I would say, that just points out that it's in both cases, it's not clear who's at fault.
Or maybe it's
the
hill.
Regulation.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, and this brings, I'm going to answer that too, and it brings me back to something I wanted to comment on your the first discussion, is that as a person who worked in finance, let me just tell you, you can write a model and tell everyone in sight, this model is not meant to be going to predict mortgage-backed securities in the real world. And that's what it's going to be used for if it's politically useful for the people who are in charge. So it's not, so that's another thing that makes it hard. I'm not answering your question in the affirmative, I'm saying it's even harder than that. Because you have the modeler and then you have the political ecosystem in the firm that decides to use your model in a way that's convenient for them. And yes, they keep you around as the person who made the model just in case it fucks up and it's your fault. But yeah, I mean, pretty much all the modelers of risk knew that their models were unsuited for how they were being used, but that wasn't up to them. And I would even go further, I'd say, the models failed, but the larger political model succeeded. The larger model, which is we're going to make a lot of money, partly because we're going to use this so-called mathematical magical model as our cover, and then we're going to get lots of year-end bonuses and not go to jail. That whole larger model succeeded brilliantly.
Just the small point I want to make is that on some level, laws too have algorithmic properties. They have some characteristics of algorithms. And the example, and I bet Kathy knows a ton about this, there's some concern in some circles about algorithmic trading, about high frequency trading, flash crashes. Most people don't even really kind of understand their own high frequency practices in these big investment firms. So there was a call for a little while to impose a fraction of a penny tax on all securities transactions, which the overwhelming majority of transactions wouldn't change much about the transaction. It would be such a tiny thing that you wouldn't even notice. Wouldn't have any serious economic effect, but it would have an enormous economic effect on the profitability of very high frequency trading. And I don't think it came to anything.
It's actually still going through in Europe in various countries.
In Europe. Yeah. So go to Europe.
Everything's better in Europe. So we started a little late. We're ending a little late, but I think we need to wrap it up here. So let's thank our panelists. And thanks to everyone for your very interesting and insightful questions.